Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. Sexual harassment in the workplace is not the new normal. Tools and tips for creating a workplace where you thrive and bullies do not. My name is Avendaño, and I'll introduce myself in a second. I'm going to introduce the other instructors, and then I'm going to give you a very quick thumbnail of what you can expect from this session. First, Erin Polkey is going to lead us off. Erin is a staff attorney for outreach and engagement at Futures Without Violence, where he focuses on workplace safety and judicial education initiatives. Paula Brantner will follow. Paula is the president and principal of PB Work Solutions, where she builds harassment and toxic workplace prevention systems. And finally, I'm Avendaño, a lifelong worker advocate, a survivor, a union lawyer, and co-founder of Survivors Know, a new membership-based nonprofit created to bring survivors together to dismantle systems of oppression in the workplace. In terms of this session, Erin is going to work with us on an exercise to help us focus on the issue of workplace harassment. And I just want to take a sec and recognize that this is really a difficult topic to talk about, to think about. It may trigger some memories or other experiences for you. So I really encourage you to be conscious and careful. You can always come back and look at this recording at another time if you feel that you have to step away for a second. So just encouraging you to practice self-care. After Erin's exercise, Paula is going to walk us through this thing we call the legal system. When it comes to sexual harassment in the workplace, we often think of justice through the legal lens. Every time a high-level executive or some powerful professor or other powerful person or people are exposed as harassers, companies, universities call in the lawyers to conduct an investigation, and guess what? Most of the time, the lawyers conclude that no law was violated, and so nothing happens, or at most, they fire the one who they label one bad apple, but the toxic culture continues. And Paula is going to walk us through why that is and what we can do about it. After Paula, Erin is going to walk us through some of the tools that are available to you today to take action and assess your workplace climate and how to start organizing. And then I'm just going to wrap up by telling you about Survivors Know. We're very excited to have launched this new project, and I'm going to invite you to join us to smash the patriarchy. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Anna. Again, I'm Erin Polkey. I'm with Futures Without Violence, and I'm going to try my best to do a interactive activity in this pre-recorded format. So my co-presenters are going to also participate, and we'll ask those who are watching to pull out a piece of paper if you can. And I'm going to pose the following question to you. And again, as Anna said, if there's anything that occurs or if we conjure up any bad experiences or memories, again, we encourage you all to take care of yourself in any way that's appropriate for your particular situation. So my question is to think back to an incident or a circumstance or a situation of sexual harassment in the workplace. It could be something that a coworker or family member experienced. It could unfortunately be something that maybe you have survived. It may be something that you learned about on the news, on TV. So just, get into your head the facts of a situation. And I'll ask you to write down the answer to what I'm calling for this presentation, sort of the 3 Ps. So the first thing I'll ask you to consider is, was the situation preventable? All right. And if it was preventable, If your answer is yes, it was preventable, then please just jot down a couple of notes as to how it could have been prevented. The second P was the situation predictable, right? Was there any sign prior to the circumstance coming to public attention or to your attention, and obviously, or your experience, that it could have been predicted in the past, it could have been predicted in the future that this person may have perpetrated that act of sexual harassment that you are thinking of. And then the third P, and it could be both the third and fourth P, because I'm going to use two words here, are the words power and privilege. How did power dynamics and how did any manner of privilege influence the fact that the situation happened, or influence the fact that it was predictable or preventable, or any responses? So think about an issue of sexual harassment that has come to your attention in any form. Was it preventable? And if so, how? Was it preventable? And if so, how? And then how did power and privilege intersect? So normally, if we were in person and there was a big group here, I'd give a little bit more time, but for the purposes of efficiency, I'm going to be presumptuous enough to assume that my co-presenters here have already thought through their circumstances, and I'd ask if either one is comfortable of walking us through whatever they feel comfortable sharing, and then just kind of point out those P's with respect to that particular incident. So Paula or Anna, either one, please go first.
Go ahead, Paula.
So I have counseled a number, probably in the thousands, of people who have gone through these incidents. And one thing I think in almost all of them are common, as Aaron has pointed out, these P's exist in all of these cases. In terms of preventable, almost all instances, there either aren't policies, there aren't reporting mechanisms, there aren't places to go when you have encountered or experienced harassment or sexual violence. And so workplaces have to do a better job at setting up places for people to turn when these happen. Predictable, often there are patterns of conduct and behavior that are part of the culture, and they happen over and over again. And so they usually are predictable. In terms of power and privilege, people do this harm because they know they can get away with it. They have a position of power and privilege in the workplace where they are allowed to essentially behave as they want, and they know that, most likely that's never going to be challenged. We're starting to try to change that, but that is a typical pattern that happens.
Thanks, Paula. Anna?
Yeah, so I'm going to put everything that Paula just said in a very concrete example of someone that I just spoke with in the last couple of days, who worked at a large nonprofit where they are really thinking about the new digital strategies, the new technology, the new frontier. And so they brought in a man to lead this work, who was, from the beginning was seen as a superstar. And he harassed several women who reported it, and nothing has happened. He continues to work at this place. Meanwhile, several of the women he has harassed are no longer there. So in terms of this being preventable, absolutely. This person came into this job with a long history, most likely, of this kind of conduct. And so when he was hired, they could have asked his former employers, other people, they could have just done due diligence. The question of whether someone has been accused or committed harassment in the past is never asked, or very rarely asked, at interviews. In terms of predictable, absolutely. Every act of harassment that this person perpetrates encourages and fuels future acts of harassment unless they are held accountable for it. these harassers feel they get energy, they get power from getting away with it. And in terms of privilege, of course, and power, this person had the slap in the back of the CEO. He's seen as the CEO's superstar. So that power and the privilege shields this person from any accountability.
Thanks, Anna. And so if you're walking through this in your particular circumstance that you thought of, those who are watching, first, I'd like to say that I'm sorry that those circumstances happened. It breaks all of our hearts to hear of those facts, and particularly with what you just said, Anna. It's just such a pattern there of someone who comes in and has the protection of being a quote unquote superstar, which probably also is another reason that no one looked into their history. And then that superstar status denies the accountability necessary. So when others see that these incidents are happening and they see that there's no response or the person's allowed to continue, then that's where that opportunity to predict future incidents really manifests itself. And so frequently we hear of folks say, we've known that that's been going on for years, and we could have told you. And not only in often examples because the perpetrator, the person who's using sexual harassment as an opportunity to assert power and control over another has done it before, but oftentimes those folks are bullies and show discriminatory behavior in multiple fronts that provide opportunities to predict that if they are asserting power and control on the basis of multiple identities, once it gets to an actionable act of sexual harassment, oftentimes in our discussions, we hear from folks that they could have reported the capability of that person to conduct themselves that way well far in advance. So I'd like to thank you all, both of you and those of you who are watching, for engaging in that icebreaker to set a little bit of context. And then now I'm going to pass it to Paula to speak a little bit more specifically about how the law intersects with this issue, and unfortunately the sad truth, which is as the law in multiple jurisdictions and at the federal level is currently constituted, simply put, it's failing survivors. So Paula, happy to pass it to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Let me share my screen here. I have a background as an attorney representing workers in harassment and discrimination cases. And early on in my career, I litigated these cases, and it got me thinking about, with my experience with my clients, was this legal system really protecting people? I moved on to become a nonprofit leader through the organization Workplace Fairness, and through the website workplacefairness.org, counseled millions of workers over the years about what their legal rights were in harassment and toxic workplace environments. And again, I often felt like there was very little that we could do. 4 years ago, I started my consulting firm, PUB Work Solutions, and am devoting my efforts to building harassment and toxic workplace prevention systems. And when the Me Too movement came along, I thought about the thousands of people that I had spoken to over the years, and I thought about my own experiences. And it has really broadened my horizons about conduct that for far too long we considered to be normal and part of being in the workplace. And so I am committed to how we can change that power dynamic, build, and how we do better. But first, we have to fix the legal system. Some of my recent work with the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, is building a national harassment grievance program. I also worked with Ultraviolet and Works in Progress in creating guidelines for political campaigns during the primary season, what we do when politicians and people within campaigns are accused of harassment and sexual violence, and how we can do better. I want to start by defining harassment. The definition of harassment has been a legal one. If it didn't meet the legal standard, it just didn't count. And one of the most important developments of Me Too is that we created the court of public opinion. We survivors were forced to choose other tactics because the legal system just wasn't working. And so I want to start by asking the question, how can we heal from workplace harassment despite having a system built that is designed to prevent that healing? Failing number one, the same power imbalance that facilitates harassment and assault protects the harasser. We have a system of employment at will where you can be fired for any reason or no reason. Most of the workforce is not unionized. Employers have access to lawyers who will protect them if they are accused of harassment, and they use their unlimited financial resources to make litigation too costly for most people to pursue. The law itself requires that the conduct be severe or pervasive. So you have to look at each instance and try to determine whether or not it meets that very restrictive legal standard. And that evaluates the harm after it has already happened. It's not prevention based. It's saying you can't do anything about it until it gets a certain level of harmful. We look at the reasonable woman standard. That is a societal standard. It doesn't take into account how you felt when you individually were harassed. Failing number three is there's an inverse and perverse incentive to litigate. The more you're harmed, the better your case. This requires lawyers who represent people who've been harassed to focus on the very worst cases. And you have to hang on to that trauma for the duration of the litigation. And if that causes a decline in your emotional state, that makes you a better witness. You can demonstrate the trauma and the harm that you experienced. But if you break down completely, your lawyer will tell you that your case will lose value. The legal system requires you to relive that incident over and over and over. You have to tell your supervisor or HR to report it. You have to tell others around you to prove that it happened when it did. If you're truly harmed, of course you would go to a therapist, and you're expected to do that whether or not you had the financial means to do so. You have to tell about your situation to lawyers until one agrees to take your case. And then if you pursue litigation, you have to tell the defense. They may require you to have a psychological exam. You will need to have a deposition, which may be attended by your harasser. You will have to tell your story to mediators or arbitrators, or if it's in court and you go to trial, you will have to tell your story to everyone in the courtroom over and over and over again. To prove emotional distress and make your case a valuable one, you will have to see a therapist, a mental health provider. If you didn't do that, it's questioned whether you truly suffered any harm. And if you do that, everything you tell your therapist is an open book. And the defendants will delve into your romantic relationships, your sex life, your financial records, your job history, every aspect of your life to try to prove that the harm was not the harasser's fault. Failing number 6, your trauma is public. You have to tell the facts of your complaint in a legal document that is open to the public. It's not under seal. The courtroom is open to the public. Reporters will cover your case, especially if it's a case of public interest against someone powerful. You can be subpoenaed to testify even if you don't want to talk about your situation in another case. If the information that is contained in news reports and court records will follow you throughout your life and be part of background checks, be part of your social media record. Everything is an open book. But you may be asking, with all of that, what can you do? And so I'm going to turn to some solutions that can be offered. One is be alert for retaliation. Retaliation is the biggest reason why people don't report, why they delay reporting, what details they report. But retaliation can make your case that much stronger. It is the result of the highest number of EEOC charges. It's legally prohibited. It has some of the same problems as the law, but it may work for you in the legal system in terms of improving the value of your case. Bystander intervention in civility codes. We want to empower people to take action when the conduct is not happening to them, when the conduct does not meet the legal standards but makes people uncomfortable. We want to try to interrupt the conduct before it reaches the point of the legal system. And so people around you can help intervene and help take care of you as the harassment is happening. We want to demand better workplace solutions. We want to ask for policies and trainings that go beyond the bare minimum that's required from the law. We want reporting and investigation systems that are independent and external, that don't require the fox to be in charge of the hen house. And we want transparency and accountability, not that it violates your confidentiality, but so people in the workplace know that your leadership, your employer takes this matter seriously and is addressing the harms as they occur. We want to demand better apologies. 84% of the responses we get are denials and defenses. We don't need DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. We don't need slut shaming. We don't need people boosting their reputation by proxy, by having others vouch for them, or talking about, what all that they've done for women or what a great feminist they are. We don't need people trying cases in the media, and we are creating processes with Survivors Know and in my work to make sure that that does not continue to happen. We need to flip the script. We have to believe survivors and understand what survivors risk by coming forward. We have to adopt the civil standard instead of the criminal standard that says you're innocent until proven guilty. You have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. We want the civil standard, which says just more likely than not. We need better standards around consent and when and how you can consent to sexual activity. And we have to remember that due process usually does not apply to these cases, that the harasser is not entitled to due process. What they are entitled to is for the employer to have a process and procedure that fully and fairly investigates. And then we need accountability for that outcome. We also have to challenge the perfect plaintiff. 90% of clients are turned away by attorneys who buy into the same systemic biases that the rest of society does. We're finally understanding how rape culture contributes to some of the biases that we have in the courts. And we are attacking some of the ways that survivors have tried to respond on their own to harassment. We cannot give up on the legal system. It is one of the ways that we have of addressing harassment, but we have to recognize its limitations and we have to do better. And with that, I will turn over to Aaron.
Thanks, Paula. If you don't mind, I wanted to ask you a question or two before I get into my part. You spoke about the repetition that's required to be heard, and all of the players that have to hear the story over and over again, which creates a re-traumatization for the person making the report. How long these cases typically take? If it's an employer internal matter on up to something that might find itself into an EEOC-like context. How long, if a report of someone who's making the report is able to withstand the re-traumatization, how long might it take for them to get to resolution?
It can take anywhere from a year to several years. I've heard of cases that unfortunately have taken decades. But I would say more typical is somewhere between 1 to 3 years. If you actually go through the entire case and bring the matter to trial, and of course that has now been affected by COVID and courtrooms not being available, but it takes a very long time of continuing to be traumatized and not being able to move forward while this is still being litigated.
And I'm sure that probably creates a pressure to settle, right? And when one does settle, because probably it's taking so long and it's been such a harrowing experience, does that often create another burden because settlement has occurred? I often hear people say, well, they settled the case as some sort of evidence that it didn't happen or if it wasn't that serious. How does that affect survivors when there's a burden or a pressure to settle?
Well, typically the settlement is conditioned on not telling your story, not having a non-disclosure agreement in place. And employers want to essentially buy silence. And what we've seen in many of the cases that have come forward with people like Harvey Weinstein is that they have used these non-disclosure agreements to continue to engage in predatory conduct over and over and over because no one could share what happened to them with anyone else. And so we're finally realizing how harmful, what the price for that silence has been. And we're looking at efforts to either restrict non-disclosure agreements or allow them to be voluntary on the part of the survivor, but not imposed on them by their employer.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that that's important. I always try to get word out, and I think it's important to let folks know because of the media pressure on our national conversation that just because someone settled a case doesn't mean that it wasn't a good case. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that it was that person's fault. There are a number of reasons why someone might choose to enter into a settlement, even one with a non-disclosure agreement, because of personal needs, financial burdens, the impact of the situation on their family, and then simply put, as you said, Paula, the desire for it all to end. Not only do survivors want the conduct to end, but they want the conflict to end. It's not a happy situation to be in. So I think it's important for us to continuously remind people that settlements aren't, there should be no assumptions made because someone's ended the case on their own volition. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about workplace culture. And the reason why workplace culture is important is this conversation so often is limited to policies and training. And there's a framework that suggests that, every case is about some creep who everyone can detect right at the beginning, who comes into the workplace and does these egregious things that are without dispute problematic. And maybe some people knew about it and maybe some people didn't know about it, and maybe they got cover from their superiors or not, but there's a clear-cut understanding in too many popular public conversations that it's as simple as a weirdo who needs to be stopped and then we'll move on. And it's just not that easy, because if it was that easy, for the last 30 years of us all attending for every new job that we have had, from McDonald's on up to a government job, that they'll show you the video of that creep and they'll tell you, hey, if you see someone doing these things, report them and we'll deal with it. And those videos have been present for 30, 40 years. But as the resurgence of the Me Too moment has shown us, it has done little to prevent and stop this conduct from happening. And now, even in our increasingly virtual world, we're receiving reports that harassment by electronic means is still a possibility. It still has its own prevalence. and people saying inappropriate things on Zooms, inappropriate text, and it's even more sensitive because our virtual world has created a vulnerability and also an entry point into our personal spaces. So it can be even more hurtful to not be able to escape that type of conduct in the virtual capacity. So if the problem isn't only, rooting out those creeps, and yes, they do exist, but really digging into the root causes, the solution really requires us to dig into workplace culture. What type of workplace is the employer trying to create? And it's easy for employers to create mission statements where they say, they want their employees to be happy and fulfilled, and that they have a zero tolerance policy against bullying and harassment. And those are important, but there's additional questions that I'd ask an employer who's preparing to make those statements, which is, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to pay your employees enough so that if they're experiencing harassment or violence at work, that they don't fear that making a report is going to cost them their job? Are you going to tackle what Anna referred to earlier, which is the coddling of high performers or superstars? If there's someone who's the best employee worker you've ever had for 30 years, but they've been accused of harassment, would you treat that employee during an investigation the same way that you would treat someone who just started working there? Why should that long-term relationship matter? And will you also create an environment where you're allowing your workers to communicate with you and you hear them and you make changes when they say to you, well, I appreciate your statement that this is a zero tolerance environment, but I'm here to let you know that harassment occurs. Here's how it occurs, and here's why it occurs, and here's who's doing it. If those reports are coming and they aren't incident specific, is the employer prepared to look into it, take it seriously, hold folks accountable, and make the changes necessary to remove from the workplace environment all of the cultural influences that facilitated that conduct in the first place? And in our experience, we hear when workers complain about mistreatment on many fronts, from pay to advancement to the fact that there might not even be a woman on the committee that investigates harassment complaints, everything that you can imagine. We're there to talk about sexual harassment, but when the employees feel safe, what they want to talk about is workplace culture. They want to talk about everything that's happening at the workplace that allowed the harassment to flourish and allowed it to go unabated. And if you tackle some of those cultural bases, you might just create that culture of prevention where not only are you removing the fuel for harassment, but you're putting your employees, your coworkers in a position to see that this employer cares, this employer will hear me out, this employer will take me seriously, and therefore I am now comfortable reporting what I see and what I experience, because I know that the lens won't now become all about me and what I should have done and what I could have done and why I didn't leave and why I didn't complain, a lot of the things that Paula referenced. So what I'd like to refer you all to for your resource, as a resource, is Future's National Resource Center on Workplace Responses. And we in particular have developed resources that are specific to evaluating workplace culture in the context of culture and climate. These resources are available at www.workplacesrespond.org/harassment, which I will put in the chat box as soon as I'm done walking you through them. But the first resource I'd like to refer you to, and you'll see it up at the top of the page there too, is how to create a robust climate survey that truly digs into the gaps that exist and what employees need, what their expectations are, to create a culture that does not facilitate sexual harassment. And before I go into this particular resource, I want to let you know that asking employers to conduct the climate survey, being part of the conducting of the climate survey, being part of developing the questions that are asked, that's something that workers, survivors themselves can organize and do within all of the limitations that might exist in particular workplaces. So I'm saying do this safely. But if you can get workers together and say, we're going to petition our supervisors, our management team to really assess workplace culture, to really conduct a climate survey. And in a second, I'll talk about another practice that's called culture walks. This is a great organizing opportunity because it avoids the employer doing what employers are inclined to do, which is take it up themselves, maybe hire a contractor, create all the questions, get it out there, have complete custody of all the results, and then ultimately at the end of the process, you might find that your employer tells you that all the workers here are happy. That's not optimal. What you really want is to be part of it, right? You want to initiate it, and you want to have the workplace create a committee that's fully reflective of the entire workforce, developing the whole thing, having access to the response, protecting its anonymity and confidentiality on whatever platform you use to receive the response, so that in the event that it does uncover something, that the employer does not have an incentive. And not all employers are bad, but you have to always remove incentives to take action to obfuscate the results of the survey. So really, employers tend to focus on the assessment category of prevalence when they develop these surveys. They tend to want to speak more about, we want to know if this is happening, how often it's happening, and in what ways it's happening. And that's fine. Prevalence is important. But prevalence isn't only it, because those of us in the field, we can pretty much answer the question, which is the statistics suggest that when you get to certain workplaces of certain sizes and such, something's probably happening just about everywhere at different scales and at different rates. So the prevalence information is important, but that's not the end of the story. The story continues when it goes into the zone of how workers feel about equity at their workplace. Do they believe that they're entitled or that they will receive equal opportunity and fair treatment there? Do they believe that there is room for advancement? Do they believe that they will be heard or believed? Are they worried that is there something about their identity, their race, their gender identity, their disability or ability status, their income level, their education level? All of the identities that we bring into work can truly impact not only whether or not we're taken seriously when we make a report, but since sexual harassment is just another assertion of power and control, if an identity has historical marginalization, our work tells us that those are the spaces that those who perpetrate harassment dwell, because that's where they can take advantage of people, and that's when they think that they can get away with it. And then finally, accountability. You know, too many workplaces have stories where longtime workers can say, listen, there's no accountability here. People have made reports for years, nothing has happened, or people have made reports and they haven't heard anything about the investigation and the results of the report until the end of it. We don't believe in the process. We see it on paper, we've heard about the policy, but I can tell you right now that 5 examples of a time where someone tried to invoke the process and it didn't work. So if an employee, if a worker is saying that to me, imagine what they're saying to their coworkers who may or may not be having experiences. So then what it does is it unfortunately metastasizes into the workplace culture where everyone's saying, hey, all bets are off. If you're being harassed, you either need to deal with it, or you need to take action to protect yourself, or you need to leave, because I'm letting you know that before you got here, there was someone who had power, a woman who was an officer of this organization, as a hypothetical example, who tried to make a report and she was marginalized and shown the door. So if you think that that would happen to her, what does that mean for you? So you have to assess how workers believe in accountability. So we go on to talk about establishing a safe space, which is the anonymity questions, making sure that not only people are safe taking the survey because they're not worried that there'll be adverse action taken against them, but also that they know that there's help out there available if the process of taking the survey itself creates a trauma response because of previous experiences. So safety is a big, important piece of this. And then broad and inclusive questions, right? There's an interesting, I find it fascinating aspect of asking people about sexual harassment. And it's the EEOC had a report a few years ago that just really, really blew my mind. And if you ask somebody, have you ever had an experience with sexual harassment? In this particular case, 25% of respondents said they did. But then once some specific examples were given, right, the numbers started going up because people don't always know that certain conduct is harassing. So the numbers start going up as you give specific examples. And then when you adjust some of the statistical bases. So, you take it away from a sample, depending on the size of the workplace. This is essentially when you are surveying everybody, right? The numbers continue to go up, and the numbers in some circumstances have skyrocketed as high as 75% based solely on who you ask, how many people you ask, and what you ask. So you have to understand that the question matters. You just can't ask people, have you experienced sexual harassment? And then imagine then when you even ask questions like, have you heard about sexual harassment occurring? And then that's a whole nother can of worms that reveals the reality of a specific situation at a workplace. Next, sexual harassment is very intersectional, right? So there are acts that are overtly based on a focus on someone's gender or a apparent desire to seek sexual attention. Although sexual harassment isn't about wanting to have sex, it's usually most often about asserting power and control. But then when you get into the spaces of sexual orientation, and when you get into the spaces of racial, economic, and disability and other forms of discrimination, you tend to find trends. And the example that I often give is a worker who said to me one time that this particular harasser, who 10 years later was finally caught, I could have told you 10 years ago that they were going to be the kind of guy who would perpetrate sexual harassment, because you know what? He's been obsessed with my hair for the last 10 years. And this was a Black woman who was speaking to me. And she said that I wasn't ever sure if it was because of my race. I wasn't ever sure if it was because of my gender, but I knew it wasn't right. I knew that there was something wrong about this particular individual's repeated comments about my hair. And the problem is that worker did not feel comfortable not only reporting her discomfort, but she also didn't really know what type of misconduct that really was. And why that was problematic, because the workplace didn't have a culture where workers felt that something that I certainly know is problematic for African Americans, which is an obsession with our hair, is something that has no place in the workplace. So that was a cultural issue that was problematic there. So the resource goes to give you several examples of questions that you can ask that can get into some of these intersectional places to really start to see, oh, in addition to having incidents of sexual harassment, we see that a lot of our employees from certain identities feel marginalized or assailed on the basis of that identity. And if we do something about that, we might create a culture of prevention. And then it goes into some of these equity questions, which goes into what I already referred to with respect to advancement and empowerment, making sure that people feel like there's a place for them at a particular organization and a place for them to go. And then finally, the accountability perspective. Are you satisfied with the complaint process? And do you feel that victims have been deterred? So I'll ask you to take a good look at that resource. And then the next resource I'll briefly get into is the Culture Walk resource. And this is an infrastructure evaluation, right? This is something as simple as looking into workers getting together and looking into whether or not there's visual displays that allow for worker organizing, or are there interactions that are secret and hushed because people are afraid to talk? Is there no common area where individuals can share information and talk privately? Is there a workplace that's set up where all the powerful people have their own floor and all of the minions have their own floor? So you already know that if you are victimized, that you're not on the powerful floor and you have to go to the powerful floor to make a complaint, and everyone sees you and there's the intimidation that exists there. So I'll commend this to you as well on our website, so that you can see that from employee interactions to questions of equity to where offices and where work sites, where factories, where places are actually organized, that there's so many non-policy oriented places where sexual harassment can be facilitated. In the end, it's all about the culture. It's all about the type of workplace workers and employers together are trying to create, so that when we come to work and we do our job, we aren't sitting there afraid and on our tiptoes, and we aren't worried that just because of who we are, that one day, lo and behold, someone with more power can come do whatever they want, and then we feel that there's nothing that we can do about it. And then, as Paula said, even if we try to do something about it, that we would be stymied in some procedural challenge on the tail end. So that's the culture piece of this. I'm happy to pass it on to Anna, and then I'm going to put into the chat box right now with the hopes that that it's visible to you all, the workplacesrespond.org/harassment, so that you can have access to the resources that I just mentioned. Anna?
Thanks, Aaron. So I am now going to just quickly share my screen and talk to you a little bit about Survivors Know. And Survivors Know is, like I said earlier, a new nonprofit that is meant to create a space so that survivors can come together and learn together, share experiences, heal together, and start to implement some of the tools together that Aaron talked about. Paula and Aaron's organization are both trainers that we work with. And what we hope to do through Survivors Know is to really harness the collective power of survivors to start breaking down the systems that are keeping women and other people from being able to live their fullest lives at work. During our first cohort, we asked the simple question: if sexual harassment in the workplace didn't exist, what would your day look like? And the participants had wonderful answers that were as simple as, I would wake up in the morning, wear what I want to wear to work, show up and do my job in a way that makes me happy. And so through Survivors Know, we are actually helping people get there, that we share a dream of where the workplace should be the site of creativity, of empowerment, of learning, of really doing what we love to do. Many of us love our jobs. And we often don't like the job itself, the workplace, because we have to deal with all of these toxic personalities and bullies. And so by implementing the tools that both Futures and Aaron and Paula's organization work through, with Survivors Know, you too can actually change your workplace. It isn't just about learning how to live through the day, which many training programs are about, like how do you deal on a day-to-day basis with toxic harassers? And that's absolutely necessary. We all have to learn how to do that. But we want to go a step further. How do you dismantle the systems that are causing the harassment? How do you come together? How do you find safety in numbers? And so I really encourage you to take a look at our website, survivorsknow.org. We have tools to help you start thinking about these next steps that you could be taking, and also to join our next cohort. And meet up with other people just like you in your sector. We have a cohort that we're preparing for workers in the tech sector, a cohort that we're preparing for workers who work in construction. And I just want to highlight what both Paula and Aaron have said, that this issue is ubiquitous. It isn't limited to a certain type of workplace. We do know that male-dominated work sites are much, much more likely to have harassment as part of the normalized culture. But everywhere you look, there is sexual harassment happening. There was just a newspaper story about how domestic workers are showing up to clean a house, for example, and the homeowner is greeting them naked, or in another sort of abusive and just being abusive in ways that don't just affect your dignity, but your humanity. And that should never happen in a workplace. So again, please join us for a cohort just to learn and connect with Aaron and Paula and many of the other organizations through the Survivors Agenda, that we are all about changing the system. You know, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So with that, I just want to ask my other trainers if there's any last words you want to share, or anything else, other last thoughts.
I think this has been terrific, and hopefully everyone is able to walk away with some resources that they can personally use in their own work environment, in their own situations, can use to empower other people who are going through harassment and sexual violence experiences, and to be advocates for change in the world and work through organizations with the Survivors Agenda to dismantle some of the norms that we have built to protect harassers and enable this to occur and thrive.
Yep, I agree. I just want to say that, you know, no one deserves this conduct. No one should have to experience this. This is not inevitable. It's not natural. It's not appropriate. There's no excuse for it. It's not about what someone said or wears or who they are or what their gender is or what their sexual orientation is. This conduct is definitely disproportionately impacts individuals who identify as women, but it can impact anyone and everyone, and in particular those who aren't typical survivors of sexual harassment oftentimes face the greatest barriers in reporting because of the other revelations that might require. So I just want to look you all in the eye right now and say that no one deserves this conduct. No one deserves to be harassed, assaulted at work. And if you are experiencing harassment or assault at work, take advantage of the resources we've given to you today, or call the sexual assault hotline, which you can easily Google, call the domestic violence hotline. Any resource provider on gender-based violence is trained and equipped to help you with an issue of workplace sexual harassment that you might be experiencing, or a coworker might be experiencing, or someone you're supervising might be experiencing, or someone who you know might be experiencing. Everyone is prepared to talk you through the best solution that you need so that you can have everything that is your right and what you deserve, which is to feel safe and fulfilled in every space that you occupy, especially at work, since we spend way too much time working. So I just want to leave it with that.